Buongiorno. So this panel is on the subject of literature and transcendence. Pope Francis's notion of fratelli tutti, siblings all, is inherently an idea of transcendence. Transcending what you imagine your family to be, transcending your relationship to others. And those are some of the themes that we're going to be taking on. The pre-conversation we had, we agreed that we would talk about three different aspects of transcendence as it relates to literature. One of them is the notion of political transcendence. How do we imagine societies different from the ones we presently inhabit? Another is a notion around personal transcendence. How might we otherwise be? And the third is what we might call a spiritual transcendence, which is confronted with the mortality that is the human predicament. How do we find meaning? How do we find direction? How do we find worth in our lives and our existence? And how does literature speak to that? And we wanted to talk about these three notions, three dimensions, also in the context of transcending a certain geographical limitation. So we wanted to speak about non-Western traditions and non-Western geographies and the role of literature in those places and how it might intersect with these notions. So we're going to begin with Tash.
Thank you, Mohsin. Can you hear me? No? Hello? Yep, okay, fine. Thank you, Mohsin. So we've all approached the themes of today's panel, I think, from our own personal perspectives, and mine is a Southeast Asian one. But before I speak to how the themes of transcendence apply in a spiritual, or political, or personal sense, I'd like to start with an observation in parentheses, which is we're asked to imagine today, to question whether or not literature, which has largely been devised by secular bourgeois intelligentsia, adequately captures the whole experience of global literature, and whether it offers a possibility for transcendence. And I find at the outset there is a problem with the distinction between Western and Eastern and non-Western literature, in the sense that Western literature is always very easily and automatically linked to the intellect, to reason, a product of the age of reason and the age of enlightenment. And by contrast, non-Western literature is that which is spiritual or presumed to be spiritual. And I think this is a problem because my experience is the opposite. So much of the literature that I have experienced growing up in Asia has as its aims exactly the same as Western literature. And many of these aims are not particularly admirable. They are aimed at capturing a sort of nationalism, particularly when applied to post-colonial countries. They're aimed at defining a sort of a national identity, which is then used to define that particular group of people against other groups of people. I grew up in a Chinese Buddhist Taoist family, and I went to a Catholic mission school in a heavily Muslim country. So I think I'm quite well placed to appreciate whether or not literature has, from whatever point of view it is, that quality of offering a transcendental experience to the individual. And I was very moved to see Pope Francis's vision for literature, because that's what I felt when I was growing up, reading as a teenager Tagore, reading Kawabata, reading Pramodia. But as I progressed through my childhood and teenage years, what it seemed to me was that in Malaysia, like most where I grew up and most Southeast Asian countries, literature was used not at all to offer a transcendental experience, but rather the opposite. It was used to exclude the possibility of transcendence, to exclude the possibility of awakening, of realization of a better way of living, even for the self. And it was aimed ultimately at the reinforcement of authority over the individual. And this is what I have been thinking about during my entire career as a novelist, which is how can we return literature to its state where it can offer possibilities for transformation, for awakening, for transcendence, however you want to put it. And it seems to me that when Pope Francis refers to literature being something that is capable of holding up, of capturing our concrete existences, that is something that we have lost as writers. I think the first thing that needs to be transformed is literature itself. It is produced, whether in the West or in non-Western countries, by the bourgeoisie. It is produced by an intelligentsia, an elite intelligentsia. And this is one of the great conundrums of literature, that by and large, it is produced by a small group of people. So the challenge for us, thinking about how the personal and the political, which are very, very often linked, and you can see this particularly clearly in the political movements in Asia, in most countries in Asia now, how can we recapture that? How can writers use that possibility to reinvent what literature has become, which is something leaden, which is something, I think, no longer capable of change? How do we reverse it to become something offered by, say, Tagore, by Pramodya, by even Kawabata? That's my provocation for today.
Indeed.
Hi, I have to say, in the first place, Mohsin and Tash, that since the Reverend Spadaro invoked Turandot this morning, I'm very relieved to say that you've all taken Nessun Dorma as your watch phrase. Despite that amazingly gorgeous lunch, everybody's wide awake. Thank you very much. What I thought I might do today is also addressing part of the problem you were looking at, Tash, which is to think about whether this East-West binary is at all meaningful or has been in an early and formative part of our own history in South Asia. And I'm coming to this from my long-standing preoccupation with pluralism and how really, particularly in the subcontinent, in South Asia, but everywhere today, we need to defend the notion, the ground of pluralism against forces that are committed to unitary conceptions of the world, of life, of who you need to be, what language you need to speak. So against all of those narrow, unitary, constraining forces and ideologies, we need to think back to how incredibly varied, diverse, and plural particularly in the subcontinent, we've always been. And since this is a problem that comes to me from my training, I always think that the best way to address something that's happening today is to go back to the early 17th century. So I hope you'll be patient with me. I'm going to dwell on three very particular things, three episodes, if you will. And in each, I want us to think of how transcendence sometimes isn't a great overcoming of the worldly and the secular. Sometimes it can be a very small-scale artisanal act of moving beyond one's comfort zone, addressing the heterogeneity that we actually have but do not always recognize. And to do that, I'm going to begin by really focusing on a figure that's been very, very important to me in thinking about literature and culture and cultural production. This is the figure of the Qalandar in South Asian literary and cultural contexts. The Qalandar is a divine or a divinely inspired madman, the bearer of ecstasy and prophecy, one who approaches spiritual transcendence, but does so through a festive, carnivalesque manner, through song, through dance, through story, and whose behavior can therefore be socially and politically transgressive. So I want us to hold on to this figure, possibly as, if not someone to aspire to, a figure of inspiration for what it is that literature can do in terms of being provocative and finding new and inventive ways of being provocative. And I'm also going to use this figure of the Qalandar to question the East-West binary that somehow by default seems to be in place. I would like us to think back to how the figure of the Qalandar actually stands at, if you will, the originary point of the history of the European novel. I'm thinking back to a very peculiar figure who leaps out in 1605 from the pages of Cervantes' novel, Don Quixote, and those of you, you've all read it. If you cast your minds back, you'll remember that it's actually a metafiction. Cervantes claims that he's discovered this manuscript written by Sidi Hamete Benengeli, and the novel is actually a retelling of that manuscript. Of course, we know that this draws on a particularly painful history in Iberia and in the world generally. It's building off of the Reconquista. It's barely been a century, and a novelist like Cervantes is still dealing with the questions of erasure and translation. But if you look back at Don Quixote, he's not so much a feudal relic of chivalry and knightly aspiration out of step with an emergent secular modernity. This is the dominant reading that we all have. Think of him from this Qalandar perspective. He's a dervish who resists, who comes out of this much, much larger Arabic Islamic world of which Iberia had been a part for about 700 years. He is someone who resists oppressive reality with intense fantasy, told, of course, in tragic vein, but he conjures up parallel worlds of inspiration and conduct and continues with a certain loyalty to these impossible ideals in the face of everything that's stacked against him. So that's this strange Qalandar Quixote is one figure that I'd put in place. Also to make the point that perhaps in thinking of what role literature can play today, it might lie in rediscovering the uncomfortable and the unfamiliar which lies beneath the surfaces of what we take to be well-resolved and well-established. So I think part of what we do as writers is also to question the inheritance that we have and to look at the strangeness that inhabits that. My other two episodes, also from the early 17th century, are more South Asian. They have to do with two Jesuit figures. You'll appreciate this strange fact. One of them was called Geronimo Javier. He was a nephew of St. Francis Xavier, who is a crucial presence in Western India. What he did, together with, Mohsin, you'll appreciate this, he's your fellow city wala, together with Maulana Abdul Sattar Lahori, Javier produced a very intriguing text called the Mirat al-Quds, literally the Mirror of Holiness, which was a biography of Jesus, written for exactly one reader or one listener, the Mughal Emperor Akbar. And I've been fascinated by this circumstance. It's a very strange book. It mixes elements from the gospel with folklore, makes concessions to more South Asian notions of magic and miracle, but it's intended for the ears of power. It's intended for the emperor. It's done in the hope of, and it's in Farsi. It's the first modern biography of Jesus, not written for a European audience, not written in a European language. And it's still around. It strikes me as an act of strange, courageous translation, and also the invention, if you will, of a new story out of materials that were well entrenched within the church. I hope we'll discuss this at some point. I'm looking here at the threshold between faith and the kinds of concessions, if you will, or modifications that you might make with your own faith in the interests of translation, in the interests of communication. The other story, and this is where I end, is an English Jesuit, Thomas Stevens, who writes another biography of Jesus called the Krista Purana. He does this in a mix of Konkani and Old Marathi on the west coast of India, not far from where I live. And this also is an act of reimagination, because he takes, again, gospel materials, but retells them through the language of the Purana, which is a Sanskrit and Prakrit epic form. It's a radical way of creating a new narrative for something that's already in hand, but in the process of which that material itself changes. And what you have there, both in the Mirat al-Quds and the Krista Purana, are texts that have no home in a strange way. They're a wager on the imagination. They're a wager on the unpredictable listener or unpredictable reader. And I think that by some strange detour, they may have something to say to Pope Francis's idea of a culture of encounter. What might this mean? What are the risks of self-unmaking that we need to undertake when we stand in the presence of such encounter? So it's these thoughts that I thought I'd put across today, and see if we have something to learn from these seemingly long ago examples, or whether we're still in the same situation when we try and create these bridges between what look like dissimilar predicaments. Thank you.
So I think that building upon what both of you have said, this notion of East and West being difficult and perhaps unnecessary to entangle, and also the notion of these writers spanning these traditions. I'd like to just talk about a couple of writers. One you mentioned, of course, Cervantes. Now, Cervantes tells us that Don Quixote is actually this found manuscript authored by Cide Hamete Benegali. Cide is sir. If he were writing in Pakistan, they would call him Sayyid. Yeah. Hamete is my name, Hamid. Benegali is eggplant eater, which of course the Jews and Muslims of Iberia were very fond of bengan, or the same root word. And so we have effectively a Moorish author with a name a lot like mine, and dietary preferences similar to my own. And Cervantes is telling us that this person has authored Don Quixote. Now, much of what we hear about Don Quixote, I heard about Don Quixote at University in the United States, was, that he's tilting at these windmills and these giants, and, it's this fantasy, etc., etc. But it wasn't until I spoke to Tariq Ali, who wrote a wonderful essay about Don Quixote in London. And he said an idea which seemed so obvious, and I had not encountered it before, but it stayed with me ever since. He said that in those days, one couldn't speak of the Moorish history of Spain. Cervantes himself, as we know, was, in fact, although he lost an arm fighting the Moors and was imprisoned in North Africa, later in his life was accused of being a secret non-Christian and threatened with death, and was only spared with a final intervention. He was caught up in this conflict over, are you really of this place? Are you really of this people? Are you really of this faith? And he gives us a character, he gives us a novel, in some senses one of the foundational novels of the Western, but the world's literary traditions, with a character who is speaking of these things that you cannot speak of. He can see that all around him are people who are descended from North Africans. All around him are people who have different faiths. All around him are people who eat different foods, speak different languages, use different words for things. But we have to pretend they don't exist. And this pretense is so much of the subject of that novel. Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, on the other side of the Mediterranean, we have a figure who's a contemporary with Dante, who is Jalaluddin, known as Rumi. Now, Rumi was a poet trained as a jurist, an Islamic lawyer, and he leaves the borderlands of Afghanistan, migrates through Iran, Arabia, Iraq, Syria, winds up in Anatolia. And Rumi is known to us, he's perhaps the most widely read poet in the world today, I discovered while Googling him. he is known to us as Rumi not because that was his name, but because he was called the Roman. And the reason he was called the Roman was because he settled in Anatolia. And the reason why Anatolia was known as Rome was, of course, because until recently, Anatolia had thought of itself as Rome. We are sitting in Rome, but we're not sitting in the only city that is claimed to be Rome, because Constantinople, in its iteration itself, said it was Rome. But not only were there two Romes, but we discovered that there were indeed many types of Romans, including Rumi himself, who may not be thought of as Roman over here. He was a Muslim. He was from Central Asia. He, as far as I know, never came to Italy. Came way after the end of the Western Roman Empire, and indeed after the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, but comes to us as the Roman. And Rumi, with this strange name, brings to us, like Cervantes, a literature of transcendence. Cervantes was grappling with how does one say the unsayable? And Don Quixote is the attempt by a novelist to say what cannot be said. Rumi is grappling with exactly the same thing. So Rumi, belonging to the Sufi poetic tradition, was writing about a relationship between the human and the divine that when spoken of in overly literal terms, had in the past, there's the figure of Mansur al-Hallaj, who preceded Rumi, who was crucified and burnt at the stake for proclaiming words that, in effect, were interpreted as saying, "I am God." And for this sin, he was killed in this way. And this served as a form of, you could say, very intense literary criticism on future generations of Sufi poets who would not say things so directly ever again. And so Rumi explores this notion of our relationship with the divine and the unsayable notions of to what extent is the human and the divine separate? How do we comprehend the universe? And he found as his mode, really, in a sense, poems about love. And interestingly, very often the figure of love in his beloved in Rumi's poetry is the figure of Shams, this man with whom Rumi had a very powerful relationship. And so you have these love poems of Rumi and Shams, which are the basis of a literary tradition that still survives. And I wanted to tee this up just to, in a sense, build on what both of you have said of the fluidity between traditions, but also to begin to take on the question of what might literature do? Cervantes has given us an example of what literature might do. I think Rumi has given us an example of that. But I'd be very curious, perhaps beginning with you, Tash, as to what might literature do now?
Well, I'll just sort of rewind a little bit, just to sort of make a further observation on something we've said. Of course, there has been historically so much hybridity between Western and non-Western cultures, and I think this is not acknowledged enough. But I think the point also has to be made that where there is divergence, of course there is a lot of divergence, those divergences have to be seen. We have to judge those divergences with the same standards. So I think we can't apport, I think it's very important not to attribute values such as logic and rationality to one set of literature and the purely divine to another, because this places too much pressure on those literary traditions to produce something that is really transcendent and really transformative. And so ultimately they fail. And when they fail, what comes into that vacuum is a literature of nationalism. It is a literature of authoritarianism, very often is what I find. And I think to address your question, what to me literature is capable of doing and should be doing is social change. And it's social change in terms of how people live, in terms of not just in terms of class change, although that is something that is incredibly important, but how we relate to the environment, how we live to planetary change, how we live to climate change. All those things, I think, Zaidi mentioned earlier about novels being mysterious. And as someone who's primarily a novelist, I think this is the power of literature, the power to address the parts of ourselves that are not entirely governed by logic. When we read a novel, of course we understand intellectually what's going on within them. The writer communicates with us something, wants to communicate with us something. But a certain part of the writer's anxieties and joys gets translated into the text, which we, the reader, pick up, thus creating this sense of mystery. And I think often that is what is most exciting about literature to me. And somehow, I think we have slightly lost this. And I think maybe it's because of the surrounding anxiety about precisely what literature can do, or maybe it's because we're just a small group of people talking to each other. I mean, I don't know. I mean, and I accuse myself in a similar fashion. But how do we step out of it? How do we achieve what Father Spadaro referred to earlier as social poetry? How do we achieve that? How do we achieve the application of literature? I think it is literature at its best is transformative in that way. And I certainly remember, from a very personal point of view, as a teenager, reading people like Tagore, reading people like Pramodya, they had a really very powerful effect on me. But it's very hard to see now in many parts of the world where the same transformative powers come from within literature.
Building off of all of this, I find myself thinking about how possibly literature today is cautious. This is a very generalized kind of statement. No, let me correct that. I think there's a danger for all of us that we tend to be cautious about the possibilities of literature. I'm thinking increasingly of what literature could do, what we could artisanally do as writers in terms of pursuing what I'm in a very cautious way going to call ecstasy. And I mean that literally, etymologically. It's ecstasis. It's standing outside of where you stand. And I think that that's an invitation that all of literature at its best really holds out to us. How do we imagine ourselves otherwise? How do we get out of a certain narrow personal eye of articulation? And how do we, without speaking for the multitudes, how do we release ourselves towards others? I think that remains a challenge. With these three examples that I offered, I find myself most fascinated by this self-remaking that they all undertook, whether it was Geronimo Javier coming across, learning a new language, becoming part of a new imagination, producing a text that he knew would take him away from his theological and literary moorings, and to try and make sense to a new audience in a new country. I mean, there's not a lot of us who would try and do that today. Likewise, Thomas Stevens, who eventually creates a whole new cult of Mary in a new language, to him, new language, and ends up also contributing to this Sanskritic vocabulary. I mean, how do we operate in these intermediate spaces? Now, these seem like long ago examples, but I'm intrigued by how you might step outside of yourself to imagine a new vocabulary, a new set of techniques of affect, if you will, and how in that process you really risk becoming someone else. Which leads me to think about how possibly one of the key problems for all of us is what do we do with a certain static, sovereign sense of self that we inherit from a particular Enlightenment tradition? Can that be opened up? Can we imagine ourselves as more kaleidoscopic selves, more schismatic selves? This I think, is part of the challenge that I see for all of us.
It's in terms of the way in which literature does these things, it's interesting to think about the actual sort of technology and practicality of it. So, Cervantes, we talk of a novelist, Rumi, we talk of a poet. They're quite different technologies. So for the Sufi poets, in a way, writing at a time when the vast majority of people are not literate, within poetry is a system of transmission of words where people can know and memorize and recite poetry, and which continues to this day. You can go to mehfils in Pakistan or anywhere in the world, and you will see people sitting there reciting poetry and people listening. But what's very interesting about this is how participatory the relationship is between the poet and the audience. Now, this is both in a you could say in the form of listening practice, where you will hear words of approval from the audience. You will hear almost ecstatic cries of, "Wah." But the reader, in this case, the listener of the poem, is an active listener in this context. Now, the novel technology works somewhat differently. It gets printed and sort of sent out into the world, and it operates primarily in a world where we assume that people are literate and that mass production and distribution exists and the novel gets to them. But the novel still depends on the notion of a very participatory reader, someone who is willing to write the novel with you. This is what Cervantes is counting on. This is what each of us is counting on. We are counting on a reader who is accepting the invitation, as we offered as children to our best friend, to play make-believe together. And we will together imagine that this is the sea, and this is a ship, and those are the sharks, and we are going through it. The reader of a novel has to co-write the book, has to play a very important role. Now, it's interesting to me that at this moment, we have to reckon with, do we believe that readers are inclined to want to play that role? Or maybe that's not the right way of saying it. Certainly readers are inclined to want to play a role. That's why they read. But what of the people who don't read? What of the people who are choosing not to read? What of the people who read when they were small and then got their phones and stopped? Why don't they want to come into the playground with us and play make-believe again? And how might literature respond to that moment is what I'm very curious about from both of you.
Well, I think it's instinctively, I would say this is the great problem. How to enlarge the playground. And I think it's to do with what Ranjit mentioned earlier about questioning one's heritage. Because as writers, I think we think there's something inherent in the state of being a writer, that there will be a reader as an audience, that there will be someone coming along to the playground and joining us in this act of whatever it is we're creating. Except to do that, people have to know that this playground exists. And for some people, that there might be this space where people congregate, but a lot of people just don't know this. And, I come from a family that is very sharply divided between people who know, actually, there is a playground and I want to play, and all those who think, actually, what is this playground? We don't even know what that is. And part of it is to do with, I think, the fact that literature is it's a shrinking echo chamber. Sometimes this is what I feel, living in Western Europe, as I do most of the time now. This is how it feels to me sometimes, that it's a small group of people talking to a small group of people, and that sort of self-selection ultimately ends in a diminishing number of people. And I don't know whether this is in some way tied to the notion of how much individual power we have in the world, how much we feel that sense of agency of being able to go out and make something of our lives. Because we live in states that are ever more dictatorial, even in the West. There's a very nice sort of parallel that I've thought of recently. There's a French sociologist called Bergogneau who wrote a book called Exister par deux fois, to live twice, to exist twice, in which he talks about the dominant class of people, people who have an education, people like us, who are endlessly writing about ourselves, And what he meant was that we have two lives. We get to live our lives where we get to experience Rome, we get to meet each other, and then we get to write about it. We get to write about our own experiences and capture our own experiences. And it's a really nice companion, it's a mirror of a Tagore short story called The Living and the Dead, where a woman who is essentially cast out of her family because she's widowed, because she has no children, she's of no value to society whatsoever. And everyone thinks she's dead. Everyone thinks she's this woman, we can see her body, but she doesn't exist because she's worthless. She's so excluded that the only way she can prove that she's still alive is to kill herself. And that is how I think, and this is the great challenge of literature, how to stop people who might otherwise commit early suicide, cultural suicide, from being invited into that realm where they can talk about themselves.
Time for Q&A. I have to cut you off there. I also wanted to respond, but we'll squeeze our responses into our answers to the Q&A. Okay, would anybody like to ask a question?
Can I not ask a question, but rather give a couple of informations to add to your wonderful discussion of Don Quixote, which, as you say, is the manuscript in Arabic of a certain Cide Hamete Benengeli found by Cervantes. But the problem doesn't end there. Cervantes is walking after telling us 8 chapters worth of the story of Don Quixote. He says, I have no more. This is where it ends. I don't know the soup. And at that point, he's walking around the market in Toledo, and he finds this. He tells us that he's used to reading everything that falls in his hands, including papers found in the streets. And so he discovers this boy who is laughing out loud at a manuscript. And so he becomes curious. He says, hey, what are you reading? And he recognizes a couple of names, Don Quixote, Dulcinea. And so he takes this boy home and pays him with food for him to translate the story. So it's not only an Arabic manuscript, it is translated by a teenager. This is the great novel we're reading. So, I mean, the level of subversion of every value in the Spain of 1590s is amazing. To boot, that book, Ranjit, was published, as you said, in 1605. And it was so successful that it was imitated. The characters of Cervantes were stolen by the second-rate novelist, Alonso Fernández de Avellaneda, who published a sequel. And Cervantes was so furious that this forced him to publish his own sequel in 1615. And one of the reasons the novel is so great, so revolutionary, is this, that it had to be, there is a second volume in which the characters of the first volume interact with each other, knowing that they're the characters in the book.
Exactly.
So, the several levels of very interesting problems that this poses this is the reason the novel was so revolutionary and continues to be. Absolutely.
Also not accidental that it was Toledo,
Yes.
which was the site of the great school of translation. Yes. So, so there's so many knowing references there to a long history. But yeah, as you say, it's a maze of metafictions in a way. But thank you for that.
Thank you.
Pankaj. Oh,
Hi,
sorry,
hello. Thank you for the lovely panel. A bit of observation, perhaps a little bit of a question. Since morning, I was thinking about the word divided behind you. Are we talking about a political reality here, or are we talking about humans being divided into 2 worlds and that we are trying to bring it together, one being divine and the other being human? I think this is what we are trying to do here since morning, and we're going to do it tomorrow as well. We're trying to invent a new language, so to speak, that is both divine and human. So one thing that Reverend said in the morning, it kept haunting me, referring to Pope Francis, he said, conversations with the right tone can change everything, humans and so on. But then we are in a period where we are about to lose our faith in this old belief that we talk to humans that if we talk to humans in human language, that will be understood. We are starting to lose faith in this very basic, bare minimum of assumptions. So I was thinking, what could literature offer us there? I think I'm a little bit scaling up Mohsin's question. What if they don't join us in the playground question can also be asked. What if they don't want to speak anymore? What if they don't want to be humans anymore? Because we are approaching an unhuman future. Mm-hmm. This is what the dominant system has planned for us, all these tech guys and so on and so forth. So, if we are really courageous, if we are really brave to think about this, what can literature, or what can word in general, offer us to refresh our faith in humankind and humans around us? And make it more political, and as Tash already did, thank you Tash, how can we do it across the social classes? Yeah, I am sort of inviting you to, I don't know, what do you call it? To think together. Let's imagine.
Riff.
To riff.
Who would like to take the first stab?
I have to reflect a little more. Go ahead.
I think when we first started talking about the panel, we talked about how the personal and the political often intersect in non-Western countries, and how personal transcendence very, very often leads to political transcendence, which I mean to take to mean very simply how personal awareness leads to social change, political change. And this, I think, is still it's the only hope of literature. If how people must feel invested enough in it to be able to see how their lives can be changed in a material sense by it. I think it's really lovely. I think for most writers, we're first attracted to literature because we are a little bit different, because we see the world in a different way. We have slightly different sensibilities, even at 10, 12, 15, 17. But what about all the other people at school? They need to feel invested in this in some much more material way. They need to be able to pick up a book and see how this book can change, even how they're going to see next week. And I think this is where, what Mohsin says about the technology, it is important. We are all really wedded to the book as book form, but what if the big tech guys, what if the technology they provide can somehow be subverted? I don't know if it can, but Mary was saying earlier about how TikTok now provides us the awareness of someone in Argentina or Japan or any part of the world, and the opportunity to be seen in the way we might see one of our own national writers and give them that same validity. But somehow, I think we've reached the point, as you say, that there needs to be a sense of revolution involved in writing. And I think maybe, I don't know, smaller books, who knows? I mean, the great big epic that we're all in some ways indebted to, including Don Quixote. It has its place, but does that place invite more people to the playground? I think you're absolutely right in posing the question. Sadie has a question.
I just want to speak a little about the parochialism of the West. I was one of those Western kids, and the parochialism is so complete. I hadn't traveled until I wrote a book. And I think what happened before, my previous belief was this liberal belief that if people travel, if they make contact, if they have this encounter, there will be a transformation. I think when I met my husband's parents, Protestant missionaries practically, who went all over the world and came back with always the same idea. Here are some poor black people, here are some poor brown people. You realize that there is really a kind of ideological goggle that needs to be transformed, and books can do that. But what I thought is that the question seems so big at how do we make a new fiction, but I think it's about smaller rhetorical strategies. Like there is a little novel recently called Sisi. It's by a Haitian writer whose name unfortunately I've forgotten with my parochialism. It was published by Archipelago. And what really struck me about it is Archipelago are making a decision when they're publishing, I guess, to the parochial West, these other writers. Instead of this book being what you might expect, a story of the Haitian trauma only, it's certainly about the Haitian trauma, but the main character is a very online prostitute in the city. And so this incredible connection is made. The world is the same place. Instead of this book of like a self-essentialization, we are the victims of this terrible trauma, you are reading it in New York. Suddenly you have this hyper-modern character, very real person, living in the same reality you are, and who is also aware, in this case of this novel, that on Facebook she can exactly gather this kind of sympathy from the people in the book. It was such a clever novel. And I thought there's an example of a rhetorical strategy that kind of gets around and beyond the assumptions of parochial readers and kind of shocks you. And the moment I finished it, every Haitian headline I read was with a different mindset entirely. That is what literature can do. It was super powerful. I've read a lot of articles about Haiti, but this novel got into me in a completely different way. So I think that might be the challenge. And I guess my question is, when you're writing, are you aware of, I always think of like a duck paddling underneath very quickly. Are you aware of having to create those strategies? Because I see it, particularly in Exit West, it's a great example of getting out and under the idea of the immigrant. So I wonder what you think about those kind of strategies.
So I think there's an underlying question, which is, much of what literature does is it grants permission to love. And, if you think of what Cervantes is doing, in a sense, you can't love the Moor. You can't love what the Moor has given us. And yet Cervantes is allowing us in. What is Rumi doing with his love poems to Shams or to the universe? In a sense, there's a permission to love being granted to the audience of a Sufi poem. To love yourself, to love the universe, to love through this poem. And for me, that notion of making sort of love possible, it's a strange idea because in so many ways love is circumscribed. We're not supposed to love people who are not X, Y, Z to us. You're not supposed to love across this, that, other domain. But when you read a novel, you're engaging in something which is actually very close to love. Because, as a reader, you are allowing another consciousness into your mind. You're sitting in silence by yourself, and you are a being with the thoughts of two people living in you at one moment. There's a kind of union that occurs at that moment, which is very similar to the union that the mystics will tell us about. It's very similar to the union that the great transformative political leaders who caused us to reconsider the relationships of our groups have taught us about. And so I think, as a writer, in a way, one of the first questions that I find myself asking is, what about the question of how does one best love one's reader? If you want to have a relationship that, in a sense, is built upon a kind of potential for love, what do you do? And then for me, that journey sort of has taken me through notions of, accessibility. How do you get into this book? And so, a shorter book, a book that has less described and therefore more space for the reader to imagine themselves. It was perhaps Tash or somebody else who said that, that maybe it's a shorter sentences that might be one way. And I didn't follow that route myself. I thought, the sentence is an arbitrary thing. If we can establish cadences that feel natural to the reader, we don't need a short sentence for the sentence to be legible. We can use cadence and sort of musicality to get at an easily read sentence. But anyway, these are all various moves, and I'm sure that all of us as writers have explored different ways of doing this. But the underlying question is, can you as a writer bring yourself to love the person who might pick up this book? Because it's unclear if at this moment in literature we are seeing the writer address themselves to the reader as beloved in a way that was perhaps once sort of taken for granted. You know, the Sufi poet wrote poems to the beloved, and the beloved was also a stand-in for the reader, with the notion that, of course, the reader or the listener was the beloved. And so I think there is, you know, to us as writers, there's a sort of, if we feel that we wish to continue to communicate in these forms, and if we feel that there is some technological, cultural shift happening that is taking the reader away, like every lover who has come before us, we have to figure out how to, you know, make the beloved want to stay. And so that, I think, is in a sense part of our challenge. We have only 5 minutes left, so I think let's get, Pankaj, you had a...
Think of that as risk.
Yeah.
Love, risk. Maybe if there's time.
I would just like to add something to what you just said, Mohsen, which is, you know, when I sort of was thinking of this panel, the idea really wasn't to construct a binary between East or West. I think if you read the little question, it's about modern literature produced by the secular, really important, secular bourgeois intelligentsia, whether it's in London or in New York or in Bombay, and in fact, most of modern literature has been produced in the West. Even, I mean, the four of us, I think most of our works have been produced there. And we belong to a particular episteme, we belong to a particular way of thinking about the world. And I think I should have made that clearer. There is something that happens in the 19th century, which is that literature replaces religion as a source of transcendence. It becomes another form of transcendence. I think the question perhaps properly phrased would be, what do we do? How do we cope with the unraveling of secular modernity? Does literature just become a plaything of the secular bourgeois intelligentsia, you know, occasional source of entertainment, occasional source for them to overcome their finite lives, you know, to feel themselves in a different realm, to commune, or, you know, for it to rediscover some of these earlier ambitions that literature had, that Cervantes had, or Rumi had. I would also actually mention in this context Federico Garcia Lorca's attempt to reconnect with the Arabic and Persian tradition. So I think that's really, in a way, is the question, you know, what happens when the secular modern world, whose assumptions underwrite or underpin so much of modern literature, that itself comes into, you know, or suffers such a devastating crisis.
Would you like to respond, Ranjit?
Just briefly, also to say that, building off of what you're saying, Pankaj, it's also about, particularly for us in South Asia, it's the danger that we've all gone through of ceding what you might call civilizational ground to the right and the far right. I think it's up to us also to recover the critical, the dissident, the dissenting energies from within that tradition and to see how those can be taken forward. I think part of our problem in South Asia is that, I think elsewhere as well, is that we too readily hand things over, tradition, theology, the transcendent, the spirit. We hand these things over to the right as if these were already somehow contaminated. And I think the challenge is to retrieve those resources and see how we can animate them for ourselves or be animated by them.
Tash, do you want to conclude for us?
No. Actually, I think it's a really sort of opposite way to end because it's this co-opting of the transcendent into authoritarianism, which I think is one of the great dangers to the way we live.
I think that is a wonderful way to end. And, in the sense that there is arrayed against us this other transcendent power, which is giving people this feeling of belonging, of being greater, which is being marshaled to, very inhuman ends. But the encouraging thing is that if they can do it, it means that it can still be done. And so we just have to do it better. But thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.